Now it is my great pleasure to introduce an editor from the Well Desk, Patia Braithwaite. Patia edits the Well newsletter, which reaches 2 million readers every Thursday. Patia works closely with our columnist Jancy Dunn to craft a newsletter that feels like a conversation with a wise and trusted friend. Patia brings heart and rigor to everything she touches, and today she's here to lead a conversation with author Suleika Jaouad.
Suleika Jaouad doesn't want to be considered a mountaintop sage, but no one would blame you for finding inspiration in her work. At 22, she was diagnosed with acute myeloid leukemia. While she underwent a clinical trial, she began working on a very personal column and video series for the New York Times called Life Interrupted. It chronicled her experiences undergoing cancer treatment. It was a massive success, and in 2021, she published her first book, Between Two Kingdoms, about the before, during, and after of cancer treatment. When the pandemic hit, and most of us were trying to figure out how to shelter in place, Suleika launched the Isolation Journals, a newsletter that helps readers turn adversity into what she calls creative grist. Her latest book, The Book of Alchemy, is a collection of essays and journal prompts to encourage us all to live a more inspired life. Suleika, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me. Hi, everyone.
So in your first book, Between Two Kingdoms, you have this really powerful line. You say, "I decided to reimagine my survival as a creative act." Can you take us back to that moment and that realization?
Yes, so that realization for me started when I found myself stuck in the hospital at 22 following a leukemia diagnosis. And I was someone who, I think like a lot of kids, had this organic relationship to my creativity. As kids, we tap into our imagination, we play make-believe. We're not really concerned with the outcome of our creative work. We're making gloriously messy finger paintings and delighting in the process and not the outcome. But like a lot of kids, I had, creative injuries along the way. These moments that ignited the pilot light of self-consciousness that made me feel like maybe a certain creative pursuit wasn't worth my time or that I wasn't good at it. And so by the time I graduated from college, I was very much focused on what journalist David Brooks might describe as our resume virtues, the things that make us attractive in the marketplace. And it was only when I got sick and the possibility of participating in the world in a conventional sense, of having a career, like the careers that I was watching my friends start, wasn't available to me, that I began,
All right, that's much better. That I began to think about, that I began to return to that childlike sense of curiosity and the idea of cultivating a daily creative practice just because, not with any goal in mind, but because it was what I needed to find joy. And when you're stuck in a hospital room for many weeks on end without the possibility of even opening a window, you do have to tap into your imagination to travel beyond the confines of that fluorescent room. When you're too sick to speak to your loved ones, you have to find other ways of being in community, and all of that requires creativity. And I'm of the opinion that no matter what your day job is, we are all deeply creative. Cooking is creative. Navigating a fight with your spouse requires creative imagination and adaptation. And in exercising that muscle of creativity, we have the possibility of alchemizing what may feel like a massive life interruption, which, for me was getting this diagnosis at a young age, into something interesting and useful and maybe even beautiful.
That's really beautiful, and it strikes me as brave, this decision to not only survive, but to approach it as art. And it kind of runs counter, like you said, to these feelings that you might feel in a hospital room, powerless, at the mercy of doctors. Was it natural for you to just tap into creativity? How did you reconcile?
No part of me felt inspired or creatively motivated that first summer. I went into the hospital with a suitcase full of books, and I remember cheerfully announcing on day one to my professor dad that I was going to use my time in the hospital that summer to read through the rest of the Western canon. Now, I did not read a single one of those books. I instead attempted to set the world record for the number of Grey's Anatomy episodes watched consecutively. That's how I was navigating my illness. I was scared. I was angry. I felt profoundly stuck and isolated. And it was my friend John, who's now my husband, who I think first modeled the idea of creative alchemy to me. My husband John and I met at band camp when we were 12 and had kind of loosely stayed in touch. And when he found out that I was stuck in the hospital, that very same day, he brought his band to my hospital room unannounced, and they put on an impromptu concert for me right there in my room. And it was this incredible moment of watching this oncology ward, which I think it's fair to say is a musicless place, suddenly be filled with the sound of music, and to watch nurses and patients and doctors come out into the hospital corridors, and to watch everyone begin to clap and dance and sing, and to witness how through creative expression you can go from having one of the worst days of your life into having a sort of impromptu joyous second line. That was something that really struck me. Now, I wasn't quite sure how I was going to do that, but around that time, a friend suggested that we do something called a 100-day project. And the premise was really simple. We were going to do one small creative act a day for 100 days. And so for my 100-day project, I decided to keep a daily journal. And the process of doing that 100-day project was not easy. I went into it with a lot of apprehension. I wasn't sure that I was going to be able to keep it up, and I didn't need any more reasons to feel badly about myself. But I did it because sometimes when it feels like life has brought you to the floor, and you're in a state of despair, you need to find some way to bring in a little light, and I desperately needed a little light. And so this 100-day project, this act of keeping a journal where I could show up as my most unedited, unvarnished self, where I didn't have to put on a brave face to try to be strong for my parents, for my loved ones, to have a space where I could write it all down without worrying about it being beautiful writing or grammatical writing, and where I could just take a moment every day and write my way back to myself, was a transformational and dare I say, life-saving experience. And what I found and what I was surprised by, even though journaling is such a seemingly solitary activity, was that when I could give ink to the fear that I felt, when I could write the things I felt I couldn't say out loud, I was not only getting to be in conversation with the self, But as a result of that, I was able to be in conversation with my friends and my family and the world.
I wonder, for those of us who don't come to journaling naturally, how you suspend the critical voice or the voice of toxic positivity that tells you that you should be like, writing out fantasies in your journal instead of the truth. How'd you suspend that?
Yeah, so, the reason I wrote the book of alchemy is because journaling seems like a straightforward practice. What could be so complicated? You have your pen, you have your notebook, let's go. And yet, even as someone who has journaled from the time I could hold a pen, I can't tell you how many journals I've bought with the intention of writing my way through to the end and only filled out the first couple of pages.
Yeah.
And left the rest blank. And then, of course, I have to buy a second journal because that journal's ruined.
Absolutely.
And I need to start all over again. And so I think, we all have our own particular chorus of critical voices. And there's nothing that seems to summon them more than the blank page. And the beauty of the journal, right, is it's just for you. But what I found that I need is to be prompted. And so sometimes when you're stuck in your life, it's easy to get stuck in the same thought loops. And so I begin my journaling by reading something, as well as some sort of a prompt. And that's not to say that I have to follow the prompt. This isn't homework, but it gives me something to respond to. And when I do that, I feel like I'm able to cast aside whatever unhelpful questions are coming to mind, like what do I possibly have to say, or who even cares, or why are you rehashing the same old grievance? And I'm able to be in conversation. The other thing that helps me, and the beauty of the journal is that there's no right or wrong way to journal. There are no rules. You don't need any sort of special technical prowess or skill set. You don't have to be a capital W writer. Is writing by hand, because for me it helps to not be able to have the backspace bar, the ability to edit. I also don't reread what I write.
I was going to ask you.
And that helps quiet any sort of critical voices. And sometimes my journal entries look like doodles. Sometimes they look like a list. And I really give myself that permission that there is no right or wrong way to do it, and that it is a success if I write anything at all, whether it is a few sentences or a couple of pages. But as long as I show up and I do it, then it's a win. And it really does feel like exercising a muscle. I think when you do it consistently, you see its rewards. And no matter what comes up in a journal entry, I always feel lighter afterward.
One of the things that I know about you is that while you were undergoing treatment, you pivoted from journaling by hand, right, to like embracing other mediums. Can you say a little bit about that?
Yeah. So 3 years ago, a decade after my initial diagnosis, I found out that the leukemia was back and that I was going to need to undergo a second bone marrow transplant. And so when I entered the hospital, I knew exactly what to pack. I was like, I've got this. And I packed about 6 different journals. I had my medical journal for notes from doctor's rounds. I had a shared journal with my husband that we'd been keeping for many years. I had my personal journal. I had my reporter's journal titled Observations from the Nurse's Station. And I intended to navigate this new phase of illness the same way I had the first, which was by writing my way through. But very shortly after being admitted to the hospital, I suffered a series of complications that meant that my vision was temporarily impaired. And so writing in this way that I had cultivated for most of my adult life in this kind of free-flowing way was no longer free-flowing or comfortably accessible to me. And so rather than staying in disappointment, I decided to pivot, and I decided I was going to keep a visual journal instead. Now, I am not a trained painter. I hadn't painted since those gloriously messy finger paintings I'd done as a kid, but I was having these really intense nightmares and medication-induced hallucinations, and I would go to sleep every night feeling very frightened of whatever my subconscious was going to summon. And so I decided that I would transcribe these nightmares into sort of dream diary visual entries through watercolor. And it turned out that watercolor was an apt medium because watercolor, I soon came to realize, is not easily controlled. You're in collaboration with water. It's a kind of aquatic dance, and it's all about surrendering to the way the water moves the pigment and reveling in the happy accidents that come from it. And by the end of my hospital stay, I had covered the walls of my hospital room with these daily watercolor paintings. And I remember the young woman who would come to clean the hospital room floors one day confessing to me that she always cleaned the floors in my room for longer than necessary because she liked the way she felt being around these paintings, and that it had gone from feeling like a depressing hospital room to a surrealist art gallery. And that to me is the power of creative expression, especially when you're doing it without the goal of being a good artist or a bad artist, when you really just allow yourself to revel in whatever it is that's coming up while keeping that critical voice at bay, is that it does feel like an act of alchemy. And when we think of the word alchemy, traditionally it's as this transmutation of something considered base or worthless like lead into something precious and noble like gold. But I think through a creative practice, no matter what the particulars of a life plot twist might be or what kind of uncertainty you're navigating, we have the invitation to alchemize a painful or unsettling experience into something else.
For those of you who haven't seen Suleika's paintings, they are beautiful and ethereal. So I guess I want to push a little bit. What would you say to people who are listening to you or read your work and think like, I can't do what Suleika does. I'm not a brilliant writer. I'm not a talented painter. Like how do you, I'm sure you get that question.
So in the beginning of the pandemic, so much of that experience felt familiar to me. The experience of being isolated at home, of having to worry about every hug and handshake, and I decided to start a newsletter called Isolation Journals with the hope of sharing this journaling practice with a wider community. And I had that exact question. I wondered about how to translate this approach to a bigger community. And I was so deeply moved by the response and by the creative interpretations of journaling. So I'll share with you two of our very early community members' stories. One was a woman named Joelle who had just lost her 13-year-old daughter and was deep in grief. And she decided that her approach to journaling, and she did it in the form of a 100-day project, was going to be using her daughter's old art supplies and creating a little daily memory of her daughter. And by the end of those 100 days, she kept going because it didn't obviously erase the immense, unspeakable pain of losing your child. But she said that in the act of creating these daily visual journal entries with her daughter's supplies, she was able for the first time to access the joy of remembering her, and it became a kind of grief diary. Another community member is an 80-year-old man named Charlie from Minnesota who had never journaled before, not a writer, and he was feeling deeply isolated, both in retirement and certainly because of the pandemic. And he decided to give it a shot, and he had very low expectations going in, wasn't sure this was for him. And he, to this day, is one of our most active journalers. And the way he described it was, it feels like an adventure, and the best thing is that I don't know where it's going. And so to me, if you're skeptical about if journaling is for you, I would say give it a shot. Pick a specific increment of time. It doesn't have to be 100 days. It can be 10 days. And do it in community. Do it with your significant other, with a friend for accountability. Do it at a coffee shop together. And, you know, the Book of Alchemy is really a memoir and essays, but it's also a chorus of 100 of the most creative and inspiring minds I know who have contributed essays and prompts. And so the way I do it is I start with an essay, I read it, I do the prompt, and I allow for whatever to come up.
Do you have a favorite prompt?
I have two favorite prompts that I've been doing. So some of you know, the contributors range from, our oldest contributor is 91, the iconic Gloria Steinem, and many of the contributors are these kind of creative and cultural icons, but just as many are people you've never heard of, like our youngest contributor, who is 6 years old at the time that he wrote his essay and prompt, and is a 2-time pediatric brain cancer survivor named Lou Sullivan. But a prompt I've been doing this week is one called Just 10 Images, and it's very simple, and you write down 10 moments from the last 24 hours, stream of consciousness. And I think I love that prompt because it's so easy sometimes to feel like we're tumbling into our to-do list head first, to feel like our days are a blur, and to actually get to take a moment and pause and think through what the 10 most memorable moments may be, to me is endlessly surprising because it's always the small moments. It's, you know, the sweet nap that I got to take with our latest rescue, who is a hairless, toothless, tiny dog named Lentil. That was one of my 10 moments from the last 24 hours. It's never necessarily the big moments. And another prompt that I love that's in the book is called the To Feel List, and it is exactly what it sounds like. And so I do that before I do my to-do list. I write down what I'd like to feel that day and some ideas for how to get myself there. And so to me, these prompts, especially when I'm feeling uninspired or not feeling super motivated, have this kind of kaleidoscopic effect of just twisting the chamber and allowing the light to fall differently.
I love that. I think so many of us are dealing with heartache, uncertainty, grief, things that you've looked at unflinchingly and wrote about. If you could give people one bit of insight or advice for how to get through, what would that be?
So I learned last summer that my leukemia was back yet again. And when you learn that you have cancer for the third time, it's easy to feel like the sword of Damocles is hanging over you. It's easy to feel like you're drowning in uncertainty and the innumerable what ifs. And the advice that I was given is the advice that a lot of people give you in moments like these. And it was, you have to live every day as if it's your last. And every time I heard that sentence, I felt this intense sense of panic because it is exhausting to try to make every family dinner as meaningful as possible, to carpe diem the crap out of every single moment. So I am done doing that. I don't want to do that anymore. And instead, I've had to shift to a different mindset, which is the idea of living every day as if it's your first. To wake up with a sense of curiosity and wonder and playfulness that a newborn might, that a little kid might, and to return to that sense of uninhibited creative possibility that lives inside of us, that we have so naturally as kids. And the way that I do that is through these little acts of creative alchemy.
Beautiful. All about embracing childlike wonder. Suleika Jaouad, thank you so much for being here.